At first, this didn't sound like a mystery at all. It sounded like the kind of story people tell years later, when memory has softened just enough to rearrange details without anyone noticing. A place remembered slightly wrong. A routine compressed into something simpler than it really was. Most stories like that correct themselves once you look closely. This one didn't. My name is Rafe Quinn. I document cases that don't resolve cleanly. Not because they're dramatic, but because they resist erosion. I came across this one long after the events had already passed, when the family involved was no longer trying to prove what they remembered. They were trying to understand why the memory wouldn't loosen. If the story had stayed where it began, as a childhood memory slowly losing precision, I wouldn't have kept the file, but it didn't stay there. Something surfaced later that didn't strengthen the memory or correct it. It only made it harder to explain why the memory was still intact at all. The memory itself was ordinary. A medical office in Maroic, a mid-sized city with a hospital district that blends into the background, unless you have a reason to notice it. According to the family, their mother attended routine gynecological appointments there for years. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual. When childcare wasn't available, her children came with her and waited in the reception area. That part wasn't remarkable. What was remarkable was how consistently they remembered the waiting room. Not the doctor, not the appointments. The waiting room. The walls were painted with a forest mural, not bright, not playful, muted greens. Tall trees stretching upward without detail. There were no cartoon characters, no cheerful distractions. It wasn't designed to entertain. It was designed to keep children still. They remembered sitting on the floor with coloring books, backs against the wall, while the building stayed quiet around them. They also remembered the nurse. Her name, they said, was Elena. That may not have been her official name. It was simply the name they used. As children, they called her Elena Evergreen. Not because she suggested it, because she never corrected them. Elena read to them while their mother was inside. She listened to jokes that didn't land. She remembered which crayons they argued over. None of them described her as unusual. They emphasized that without being prompted, she wasn't strange. She wasn't dramatic. She was simply there, often enough to matter. Years passed. The children grew up. The family moved away from Maroic. Eventually one of them, Marara, returned as an adult. She was pregnant and searching for an obstetrician. Her mother suggested the same doctor she had seen years earlier. He had been young at the time, early 30s, maybe younger. It seemed reasonable that he might still be practicing. Mara searched hospital directories. The name didn't appear. That alone meant nothing. Doctors retired. Practice is close. Still, curiosity pulled her downtown. Her mother happened to be visiting, and they went together. They parked in the same garage both of them remembered. They walked the same route, past the same concrete divider, through the same side entrance. Nothing felt wrong, not yet. The first hesitation came in front of the building directory. They remembered the office being on the top floor. What they didn't remember was ever having to think about that. The directory listed 4 floors. They laughed it off. Buildings change. Floor numbers get reassigned. They assumed the office must have been on the 4th. It wasn't. They checked the 3rd, then the 2nd. Nothing matched. At that point, they accepted the most comfortable explanation. Memory, childhood memories, compressed space, routine flattens, detail. They were ready to leave. Before they did, they asked at the front desk. The staff member told them calmly that the building had never had more than 4 floors. No renovations, no removals, no renumbering, never on its own. That answer should have ended the story. It accounted for the confusion without challenging anything else. Except it didn't. Later, when they mentioned it to a 3rd person, Jonah, the brother, he didn't hesitate. He remembered the same place. Not generally, specifically. The mural, the desk placement, the nurse leaning slightly against the counter. He remembered Elena correcting his spelling while he colored. Independent recall, no coordination, no contradiction. That was the moment the explanation stopped absorbing the memory. Not because it failed logically, but because it failed structurally. The details didn't drift, they didn't soften, they stayed fixed. Years later, that unresolved tension is what brought the case to me. Not to recover a missing space, not to accuse an institution. They wanted to know whether the memory could still be allowed to fade, or whether it had reached the point where it resisted erosion. I began with the building. Public records were clear, construction plans, inspection histories, fire safety documentation. The structure had always supported 4 floors. It could not have supported another. That should have resolved the discrepancy. But removing the floor removed the office, and removing the office removed Elena. Except she didn't disappear. All 3 family members described her the same way. Not with flourish, with restraint. Samey demeanor, samey patience, samey unhurried voice. The memory didn't expand over time. It didn't sharpen. It remained unchanged. At that stage, nothing directly contradicted the records. There was only absence. Absence is easy to accept. What came later, when I no longer expected the case to change, made that absence unstable. Whatever surfaced did not restore the missing floor. It did not validate the memory. It simply made the absence harder to trust. I document cases like this because patterns tend to disappear when people stop paying attention. If you want to stay inside them as they unfold, you already know how this works. That moment doesn't appear yet in this record. But everything here is necessary for it to matter when it does. Because when it appears and where, and when you understand where it was found, the problem will no longer be whether the 5th floor ever existed. It will be whether certainty can survive once something refuses to disappear. That was the point where I stopped treating this as a routine discrepancy. Not because I had found proof, but because nothing had been disproven cleanly enough to settle. Once a story reaches the point where records and memory disagree, there are only 2 ways it can go. Either the records are incomplete, which happens more often than people think, or the memory is wrong, which happens even more frequently. Most cases end there. This one didn't. After confirming that the building had never supported a 5th floor, I expected the remaining work to be procedural. Identify when the memory formed, identify how it spread, document how it stabilized. That's usually enough. What complicated this case was not what people remembered, but who didn't. I contacted the hospital administration associated with the building, not with accusations, not with theories. I asked a narrow question. Had there ever been a gynecology practice operating out of that structure during the period in question? The answer came back quickly. Number that response wasn't surprising. Hospitals are good at tracking departments. Practices move, names change, but institutional memory tends to leave traces. Billing records, department rosters, internal memos. None of those existed. At this point, the simplest explanation still held. The practice had never been there. The family's memory had attached itself to the wrong location. That explanation accounted for almost everything. Almost. I asked for staff directories from the same period, not names, just categories. Nursing staff assigned to outpatient clinics in adjacent buildings. The hospital provided what they could. Most of the names meant nothing, except one omission. There was no nursing role listed that matched the responsibilities the family described. Not part-time, not temporary, not floating. That didn't mean Elena didn't exist. It meant she didn't exist there, at least not officially. I followed the administrative trail outward. Satellite clinics, affiliated practices, temporary leasing arrangements. Every path led to the same outcome. The practice described by the family was not documented in that building. This was the point where I expected the memory to collapse. When people are presented with consistent absence, something usually gives way. Details soften, certainty weakens. That didn't happen here. I spoke with each family member separately, not to interrogate, to document. I asked them to describe Elena again, not the setting, not the events, just her. Their descriptions aligned, not word for word, but structurally. Her posture, her tone, her habit of standing rather than sitting. None of these details proved anything, but they didn't diverge either. More importantly, their recollections didn't grow. They didn't elaborate over time. They didn't fill gaps. The memory stayed fixed. That's unusual. At this stage, the most reasonable explanation was still the simplest one. The nurse existed. The location didn't, meaning the memory had misfiled the place, not the person. That explanation almost worked, so I tested it. I asked the family to describe any other medical settings they frequented during that period. Other clinics, other offices. They listed several pediatric visits, urgent care, dental offices. None of those matched the memory. The forest mural didn't appear anywhere else. The routine didn't transfer. The nurse didn't relocate. The memory remained anchored to a space that records insisted was incomplete. I returned to the building once, not to search, to observe. It looked exactly as it should. Neutral signage, administrative quiet. Nothing about it suggested alteration. Nothing about it invited suspicion. That was the problem, if something had changed. If there were signs of removal or revision, the contradiction would have somewhere to settle. Instead, the building behaved as if it had always been correct. I reviewed renovation permits again, not for additions, for cosmetic changes, paint, lighting, interior redesigns. There had been several over the years, none involving floor layout, none involving murals. That detail mattered, because the family didn't remember artwork vaguely. They remembered it intentionally. The mural had not been decorative. It had been functional. It kept children still. At this point, the case stopped progressing forward. Every path led back to absence. Every attempt to relocate the memory failed. Nothing new appeared. Nothing contradicted the records. Nothing explained the persistence. That's usually where cases end, not with answers, but with exhaustion. People get tired of uncertainty. They accept the explanation that hurts the least. This family didn't. What shifted the case was not a discovery. It was a delay. Time passed. Months, I stopped expecting the file to change. Then I received a follow-up message. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't dramatic. It was an update. One of the family members had been organizing old personal materials, unrelated to the investigation. Boxes that had been stored and forgotten. What they found didn't resolve anything. It didn't even clarify what they were looking at. But it didn't belong with the rest of the information either. I didn't ask for conclusions. I asked for documentation. What they sent next would not have mattered if everything else had aligned. But it didn't. And because it didn't, the object created a contradiction that records alone could not absorb. That object does not appear here. Not yet. What matters in this part of the case is that until this point, nothing existed that should not have. There were only missing things, missing floors, missing offices, missing documentation. Absence is manageable, presence is not. After that moment, the case stopped behaving like a memory problem. It didn't become something else. It simply refused to stabilize. And once that happens, the investigation changes, not because new answers appear, but because old ones stop holding. This was the point where I reclassified the file, not as unresolved, but as incomplete in a way that no longer responded to verification. Everything that follows depends on what surfaced later and where it surfaced. Because the problem was never that something was remembered incorrectly. It was that something remained after it should have disappeared. Up to this point, the case had only been defined by what was missing. A floor that did not exist, an office that could not be located, records that never appeared. Absence is uncomfortable, but it's stable. You can build explanations around absence. What followed was different. The message came without urgency. No language that implied resolution. It was framed as an afterthought. One of the family members had been sorting through stored belongings. Boxes that had been moved from place to place and eventually forgotten. Nothing connected to the case. Nothing intentional. They weren't looking for evidence. That distinction matters. People who search for proof tend to shape what they find. This was incidental. Inside one of the boxes was an envelope. Not sealed, not labeled. It had been folded into itself several times, the way paper is when it's carried and put away without purpose. Inside was a photograph. Before I describe it, I want to be clear about what it was not. It was not dramatic, it was not damage. It was not stylized. It wasn't the kind of photograph people say for a reason. That was the first problem. The image showed a woman standing behind a reception counter. She was wearing medical scrubs. Neutral color. No visible logo. Behind her was a wall. Pale, unremarkable, and part of a desk surface. No signage, no identifying text. Nothing that placed her in a specific location. All three family members identified her immediately, not with excitement. With recognition. They didn't debate, they didn't hesitate, they didn't qualify their certainty. They said it was Elena. I asked them to explain how they knew. They didn't describe features, they described familiarity. The way her posture leaned slightly forward, the way her shoulders sat at rest, the expression she carried when she wasn't addressing anyone directly. Details that aren't diagnostic. Details that don't survive imagination easily. At first glance, the photograph didn't contradict anything. A nurse existing was never the issue. The issue was context. And context was missing. There was no date on the photo. No handwriting. No stamp. The paper stock suggested it wasn't recent, but not old enough to place without guesswork. It could have been printed anywhere, at any time. That explanation almost worked. I asked where the photograph had been found. The answer complicated things. It had been stored with materials from the same period as the childhood visits. School papers, old calendars, receipts. Nothing recent, nothing that would explain later introduction. Still, that wasn't enough to destabilize the case. Photographs drift. They end up in the wrong places. I needed to understand where the image came from. I asked the family if they remembered the photo being taken. They didn't. Not one of them. That absence of memory mattered. Because they remembered Elena clearly, but not this moment. I asked whether the photo could have been taken somewhere else. Another clinic, another building. They considered it, then dismissed it. Not emotionally, logically. The counter height, the angle of the shot. It matched the waiting room they remembered. Not exactly, but close enough to resist reassignment. At this stage, the photograph didn't prove anything, but it changed the structure of the problem, because now there was something present that shouldn't have been necessary. The memory no longer stood alone. I requested a digital copy. When I reviewed it, nothing in the background offered clarity. No windows, no visible doors, no floor indicators. Just a fragment of space, and a woman who shouldn't have been associated with any identifiable place. I attempted to trace the image. Metadata was minimal. The file had been transferred between devices. Original capture information was gone. That didn't raise suspicion. It raised frustration. I contacted the hospital again. Not with the photo, not yet. I asked about archive staff images, yearbooks, bulletin boards, internal newsletters. They had some. Most were incomplete. None featured the woman In the photograph, I showed the image to one current staff member, carefully, without framing, without explanation. They didn't recognize her. That response was expected. Time erodes familiarity. What wasn't expected was the consistency. No one misidentified her. No one guessed. They simply said they didn't know. At this point, the photograph existed in isolation. It didn't connect to the building. It didn't connect to records. It didn't even connect to a documented role, which should have made it harmless. It didn't, because the photograph did one thing the absence never had. It forced coexistence, you could no longer say. There was nothing there. There was something, you just couldn't place it. I returned to the building one final time, not to search, to compare. I stood in the reception area. I noted counter heights, lighting angles, the way space was divided. Nothing matched exactly, but nothing ruled it out either. That ambiguity mattered more than confirmation, because confirmation would have stabilized the contradiction. This did the opposite. I reviewed the image again. The woman's posture suggested familiarity with the space. Not a visitor, not a patient. Someone who belonged behind that desk. That was an assumption. I wrote it down anyway. Up to this point, the investigation had been defined by elimination. Now, it was defined by resistance. The photograph resisted classification. It refused to be absorbed by any explanation that didn't break something else. If the building never had a fifth floor, the photo had nowhere to belong. If the photo was taken elsewhere, the family's memory had aligned around the wrong space, too precisely to dismiss. If the nurse never worked there, then the photo should not exist alongside the memory at all. Each explanation repaired one fault and created another. I didn't present these conclusions to the family. I presented the problem. They understood immediately, not because it was frightening, but because it was unstable from that moment on. No new information appeared. No additional records surfaced. Nothing changed, except the way the earlier absence felt. Before the photograph, absence was neutral. After it, absence felt selective, as if something had been removed, not erased. That distinction matters. Erasure leaves traces. Removal leaves space. This case had both. I documented the photograph. I documented its lack of origin. I documented the inability to place it without contradiction. And then I stopped. Not because the investigation was complete, but because it had reached a condition where additional verification no longer increased clarity. It only added weight. The family asked me what I thought the photograph meant. I told them the truth. I told them it didn't mean anything by itself. It only mattered because of everything it couldn't coexist with. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't before. The problem was never whether the fifth floor existed. It was whether a memory could be disproven once it left evidence behind. After that, I closed the file, not as resolved, not as unsolved, as unstable, because the photograph didn't answer the question. It ensured the question could no longer be ignored. After the photograph entered the case, nothing else surfaced. That wasn't because I stopped looking. It was because the investigation had reached a state where movement no longer produced change. Every verification returned the same result. Every follow-up circled back to the same contradictions. The case had stopped progressing forward and started repeating itself. I revisited the earlier assumptions, not to challenge them, to see whether they still held. The building had never had a fifth floor. That remained consistent. No new permits appeared. No overlooked documentation surfaced. The structure behaved exactly as it always had. The hospital's position didn't shift either. They acknowledged the photograph without recognizing it. They reviewed archived materials again. Nothing connected. No staff role aligned. No temporary placement explained it. The institution remained internally consistent. That consistency was important, because it meant the contradiction wasn't growing. It was fixed. I spoke with the family again, not to extract new details, to see whether the memory changed now that the photograph existed. It didn't. They didn't reinterpret it. They didn't strengthen it. They didn't revise it to accommodate the image. The memory and the photograph remained separate, aligned in familiarity, disconnected in context. That separation mattered. In most cases, new evidence reshapes recollection. People adjust their memories to fit objects. Here, the opposite happened. The memory resisted the photograph, and the photograph refused to clarify the memory. I returned to the image one last time, not to analyze it, to confirm that it hadn't changed. That may sound unnecessary. It wasn't in unstable cases. Details tend to drift. Descriptions sharpen. Certainty grows. This one didn't. The photograph remained exactly what it had been the first time I saw it. A woman behind a desk, nothing more, nothing less. At this point, there were no remaining productive actions. Every path led back to one of three outcomes. Absence confirmed presence, unplaceable memory. Unchanged, no fourth option appeared. That's usually when people ask for conclusions. They want something to land on. The family asked me whether the photograph meant their memory was real. I told them it meant the memory was unsupported, not disproven. That distinction wasn't comforting, but it was accurate. They asked whether the building could have been altered in a way that left no record. I told them the records didn't behave that way. That answer didn't help either. They asked whether shared childhood memory could fabricate a person. I told them it could fabricate details. I didn't say it could fabricate consistency. Eventually, the questions stopped, not because they were answered, but because none of the answers changed anything. That's when I closed the file. Not formally, practically. I stopped expecting resolution. I stopped checking for updates. I documented the state the case had reached and left it there. Cases don't always end when they're solved. Some end when they stabilize. This one had. The contradictions no longer shifted. They simply existed alongside one another. There was a building with 4 floors. There was a memory anchored to a 5th. There was a photograph with no location. There was a nurse no institution could place. None of those facts displaced the others. That coexistence was the final condition of the case. Not uncertainty, not mystery, but incompatibility. I've learned to recognize that state. It's when further investigation doesn't create clarity, only repetition. When the questions stop evolving. When explanation becomes an act of preference, not discovery. I documented everything. The absence, the photograph, the resistance of the memory, and then I stopped intervening, because at some point, continuing an investigation doesn't honor the facts. It pressures them. And this case no longer responded to pressure. The family still has the photograph. They haven't framed it. They haven't stored it away either. It exists in the same condition as the memory, present, unplaced. That's where the case remains. Not open, not closed, stable in a way that prevents it from being settled. And that's the detail I keep returning to. Not the missing floor, not the nurse, but the way certainty failed without collapsing. Some contradictions don't escalate, they don't resolve. They simply persist. I don't think about this case often, not because it was resolved, and not because it disturbed me more than others. I think about it because it reached a point where it stopped changing. Most investigations end when something is discovered. This one ended when nothing new could be added without rearranging what already existed. After I closed the file, I didn't hear from the family for a long time. When they did reach out again, it wasn't with new information. It was with the same details, repeated carefully, as if repetition might loosen them. It didn't. Time passed. Years in some cases. The memory didn't sharpen, but it didn't erode either. It remained exactly where it had been, intact, unchanged, and resistant to adjustment. The photograph stayed with them, not displayed, not hidden. Sometimes it was kept in a drawer. Sometimes it sat on a desk. They never framed it. They never threw it away. It existed the same way the memory did, present but unplaced. I asked once whether they had shown it to anyone new. They had, friends, extended family. No one recognized the woman. No one questioned the setting. Most people glanced at it and moved on. That reaction unsettled them more than disbelief would have. Eventually, the questions slowed, not because answers appeared, but because nothing changed when the questions were asked. The case reached its final condition. I've learned that some investigations don't end with conclusions. They end when patterns stabilize, when contradictions stop evolving, when information refuses to reorganize itself into something cleaner. That's what happened here. There was a building with 4 floors. There was a routine remembered on a 5th. There was a nurse recalled consistently. There was a photograph that could not be placed. Each fact remained intact. None absorbed the others. If any one of those elements had shifted, the case might have settled. If the memory had weakened, it could have been dismissed. If the records had fractured, the absence could have softened. If the photograph had carried context, it could have anchored everything. None of that happened. What remained wasn't confusion. It was incompatibility. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that only becomes noticeable once everything else behaves normally. I documented the case because it reached the limit of what verification could change. Not because it suggested something extraordinary, but because it showed how easily certainty can fail without collapsing. Everyone who's reviewed this file has settled on a different conclusion, not because the facts change, but because the order they trust them in does. At some point, the investigation stopped producing answers and started producing preferences. That's usually where the record ends. The building still stands. The photograph still exists. The memory still occupies a space that can't be located. None of those things have moved. That's where this case remains. Not open, not closed, just unchanged. And that's why it was written down. Not to resolve it, but to preserve the moment where understanding stopped improving and began repeating itself instead.